Sam Bliss. Now, Sam is a PhD candidate at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and he teaches the Department of Community Development and Applied Economics. Sam studies and participates in the production and distribution of food that's not for sale in northern New England. He gardens, fishes, forages, dumpster dives, and shares food through the mutual aid collective Food Not Cops. He's a fellow of the Gund Institute for the Environment, the Agroecology and Livelihood Collaborative, and Research in Degrowth. And he is president of Degrowth US. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. No, that was great. Yeah, thank you all. I'm really excited to have been invited to come talk because of the topic of this panel. I'm going to talk about economic growth, and I'm also going to introduce this idea, degrowth, that I'm really excited about, and so are lots of others in my field. I'm an ecological economist, and since I'm not a professional farmer, I'm going to try to present this in a way that asks more questions than I answer, and then hopefully you all will have more questions back for me, or maybe some responses to some of the questions that I'm going to pose. So degrowth, for what it's worth, is basically the idea of equitably downscaling the economies of wealthy nations. So, but first we're going to talk about growth. Next slide. There we go. So this is a chart that I'm going to talk about things related to agriculture, if I can help it, but this one is about energy, and I think it displays some of the dynamics of growth, historically and globally. So it basically shows different energy sources and the total contributions to world energy supply over the last 220 years. So like in the 1800s, virtually all of the energy in the world came from burning wood and other plant matter. And then improvements in efficiency in the steam engine made it make sense to start taking more coal out of the ground, and the Industrial Revolution happened, and then they struck oil in Texas and Pennsylvania, and then they figured out ways to get the natural gas through pipelines to places where it could be consumed, and then nuclear power plants came online in the middle of the 20th century, and they were damming a bunch of big rivers for hydroelectricity. And more recently, there's been solar and wind and other renewable forms of energy that are this tiny little sliver at the top of the chart. I wish I could point to it for you all, but and this only goes to 2010, so that little sliver has grown substantially over the last 10 years, but it's still a sliver. 84% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and so a lot of the folks who are who are doing climate modeling, who are trying to analyze scenarios for keeping warming under 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, basically they show that there's two options for doing that. One is you assume that there's magical technologies that don't yet exist and are pretty risky that are going to come save the day. So that's basically, for the most part, planting large areas of either forest or crops to cut down, burn in a power plant, capture the carbon emissions out of the smokestack, and then store it underground forever. So technology that doesn't yet exist. And the other option is degrowth. So it's intuitive that transforming a smaller energy system to run on low carbon fuels is easier than a larger and growing one. So this is like the climate argument for confronting economic growth, or for ending economic growth. That it's the only way we're going to stop, because all these energy sources, none of them decrease. Even biofuels, like they just add one on top of the other on top of the other as new energy sources come online. They don't replace what's before. Only by decreasing the overall scale might that happen, is the line of thinking, at least. So, but why am I conflating growth and energy use with economic growth? Because economic growth is measured in dollars, right? It's the total money value of everything that an economy produces in a year. Everything that's sold as a final good or service in Canada is the total amount of money that is Canada's GDP. So growth is just when that increases. But the reason I'm talking about these things as if they are one and the same is because I'm an ecological economist, and I think of the economy as a machine that uses energy to turn nature into stuff and waste, and then the stuff eventually becomes waste too, and that waste is inevitable. It's a law of thermodynamics and entropy. It says you can't do anything without making a mess too. So that waste, you can decrease it, you can introduce recycling and some of these things they're calling circular economy, but it really just slows down the process of everything becoming waste. And only through new energy can that waste then become useful again. So I think of the economy that way. And from that perspective, growth is using more energy to turn more materials into more stuff and create more waste. So that might seem really simplistic, and it might seem simplistic that this box just gets bigger, but it really is humanity taking over larger and larger swaths of the surface of the earth. And that, means destroying habitats. It means extinction of species, which is, sometimes called biodiversity loss. And also it means extraction confronting human communities too. And environmental conflicts arise between extractive industry or polluting industry and people who already live there, indigenous peoples, local communities around the world. Canadians are no stranger to this dynamic. And again, it might seem simplistic, but it's not. So if you look at the data, you can't find, so this chart shows that the green line is gross world product or global GDP. The brownish red line is the amount of materials extracted, which is the same as the amount of materials consumed at the global level. And those are correlated about as tightly as a scientist is going to find a correlation outside of a laboratory. So it's taken since 1970 about 1 kilogram of materials from the earth to produce $1 worth of $1 worth of final goods and services. Now you can see the carbon emissions line below, which is also growing with the economy overall, but more slowly because there's been increases in energy efficiency and some transition to lower carbon fuels. So gases to some extent replaced coal, and there's been an increase in renewable energy. So what you can see there on the far right of the chart, though, is that in 2009, when the global economy shrunk, so did carbon emissions, and we can expect that the same thing had happened in 2020 as well during the economic slowdown from the pandemic. And that suggests that degrowth is part of a viable strategy to stop climate change, that producing less overall does reduce carbon emissions. And given this material conceptualization of the economy that I've introduced, it makes intuitive sense, right? So what's this look like in Canada? The top line is all the materials extracted in Canada, and the darker reddish brown line is materials consumed in Canada. So it takes out exports, because a lot of the extraction in Canada is ultimately for export. So Canada is different than a lot of other wealthy nations. Like most nations in Western Europe, they have a lot less extraction and consumption, and they import more than they export. Canada, being as enormous a country as it is, rich in natural resources, extraction-based economy, Canada extracts more than it consumes. But again, domestic material consumption in Canada grows hand in hand with the Canadian economy. So because these are just lines and it's difficult to know the magnitude of, when you're talking about trillions of dollars or billions of tons, in 2019, Canada's economy consumed 56 tons of materials per person. And though that consumption produced $56,000 worth of final goods and services per person, which the way the economy works is that $56,000 per person becomes income. And so that's $200,000 for 2019 for a family of 4. And we know that most Canadians actually don't make that much money. So that's because the economy is unequal. The top 10% of earners, the top 1% of earners skew the average upward because they have enormous incomes, whereas most people, I guess I should have got the median income for Canada in 2019, but it's well below the median, the 50th percentile, the person for whom 50% of Canadians earn more and 50% Canadians earn less is actually making way less than $56,000, as we know from our life and community, right? I'm not Canadian, but I assume it's similar to the US. And I know from statistics that it's quite unequal. So that is to say that if things were distributed more equally, there's already way more than enough. Say 56 tons of materials, $56,000 worth of goods and services. There's already way more than enough for everyone in Canada to live a decent life, have their basic needs met. But not everybody's needs are met because of inequality. So what does this 56 tons of materials mean? How do we think about that? That's 153 kilograms of materials taken from the land for each Canadian each day. So a lot of that is oil and gas that's burned to extract and refine materials that end up exported. But even if you take that out, that it's still about 90 kilograms per day. And I'm not trying to pick on Canada. It's about the same as the US. It's a little bit higher than other wealthy countries, but in the same order of magnitude. That's 90 kilograms. That's more materials than my body is consumed every day to, house, feed, clothe, shelter someone like me and entertain me. So what does that extraction look like in Canada? As you can see, since 1970, most categories of materials have grown modestly and oil and gas has grown a lot. So if we just look at biomass, that basically breaks down into logging and farming. So the top bit is wood in this chart, and the rest of it is extraction from agriculture. And I show this chart in the other one, not so much because I have any specific point to make. I think you all might want to, tell me what it means and interpret it. I'm not Canadian, again, not a professional farmer. I don't know what happened in 2002 when there was so much less agricultural production, for example. But if we're thinking about degrowing the economy overall, maybe I haven't convinced you yet, maybe I will soon. If you're thinking about having a smaller material extraction and consumption overall in the economy, it's not really about degrowing agriculture. Like, people still need to eat. Tamara Soma is going to talk after me about food waste, and I guess we could have somewhat less agricultural production if less food is wasted, or somewhat less agricultural production if people ate less meat, for example. But it's not going to degrow that much. It's degrowth is really about degrowing the non-essential and actively harmful sectors. Advertising for cigarettes comes to mind. And maybe oil sands. I know it's controversial to say, talking to people in the prairies of Canada, but maybe scaling down the oil sand sector. So if it's about degrowing or scaling down the non-essential and actively harmful bits of society, it's really about maintaining and making better qualitative improvement in the sectors like agriculture that are meeting basic human needs. So one way that the agricultural sector has been scaled down is how many people are working in it. So the percent of total employment in Canada in agriculture has decreased since 1997, as you can see, from 3% to 1.5%. So basically cut in half as a share of labor. And this is just part of a long process that I'm going to argue goes hand in hand with growth. So if you go back with census data to 1911, a third of the Canadian workforce was in agriculture. And if you go back another 100 years, it was probably 2/3. So this getting people out of agriculture is part and parcel of growth. So now it's 1.5% of the workforce that's producing food for the other 98.5%. So that's you all, that 1.5%. And that's, not just the other 98.5% of the workforce, but also children and elderly and others who don't work. So it's a lot to ask of a very tiny part of the population, and it's unprecedented historically to have such a small part of the population dedicating themselves to producing food and fiber. And I want to argue that degrowth is going to require more agricultural workers, kind of for two reasons. One is that farming ecologically is helped by having more people involved. Wes Jackson calls it eyes to acres. I would also say it's hands to acres. Just you can do more complex things, respond to the land better if you have more labor, rather than having to treat the land as a blank canvas on which to run machinery and spray chemicals, right? So But I also would say that degrowth requires more agricultural workers, because if you're scaling down non-essential and actively harmful sectors, agriculture can absorb that surplus labor. Like more people can be farming because less people are, making all the other non-agricultural goods and services. So in that way, it's a bit of a going backwards in terms of the modernization process, perhaps, but it doesn't mean you have to get rid of all the technologies that we have. It just means we choose to produce less as a society. But how, you know, how could we have more people in agriculture? Like the reason there's not as many people in agriculture is this process that you all probably know pretty well. If something gets, if machines are going to do something on one farm that human or animal power was doing before, then they can produce more cheaply, then they can sell more cheaply, and other farms in that same market are going to eventually have to adopt that technology to be able to compete, and that's going to increase the efficiency in the sense that you can get the same amount of yield or output with less labor or less resources, and that frees up workers and resources to make greater amounts and varieties of other goods and services, and that's what growth is. It's that greater amounts and varieties of all the other goods and services. And so it's the kind of the story of industrialization in a sense is this, but it's ongoing. The economy is still growing, and that happens in every sector. As an aside, I would say that like people worried about the environment and resource use often will argue that more efficient technology or more efficient processes leads to less resource use. But when you look at it from this zoomed out kind of big scale perspective, you see that actually efficiency enables growth, and growth leads to greater resource use. There hasn't been less use of basically any resource except for a few things that have been banned, like asbestos and mercury and lead. Like those are the only sorts of resources that there's actually been less use of from a global perspective. So this idea that efficiency is going to save the environment is actually mistaken. You have to, if you limit the overall scale of the economy, then efficiency can be useful. But yeah, that's just an aside. So I want to leave that question again, is like how could we have more people in the agricultural sector? I think that this dynamic I'm describing is one that sees labor getting paid less and less, forced out, automated away, and treated as poorly as possible in some cases. So what does degrowth have to do with any of this? I want to stress that degrowth implies economic reorganization. It requires some sort of political change, because it's not just like, how can we make recession livable? How can we like shrink the economy in the ways that always produce the suffering that recessions bring? It's how can we reorganize the economy so that people meet their basic human needs, even if it's not growing, reorganizing the economy to meet people's needs, regardless what happens with GDP. And how to do that in agriculture. What does that mean? How could you reorganize the economy such that farmers would have the opportunity to do things purposefully less efficiently, because they're pursuing goals other than efficiency, because they're pursuing goals that are ecological or social, or trying to produce food in ways that they can get it to folks who are otherwise food insecure, rather than having to charge more and for their specialty products, so that it only goes to folks who can afford fancy food, stuff like that. Luckily, there's been a lot written on the topic. This is just a bunch of covers of the different books that have been published on degrowth over the last just like 5 or 6 years. And this outpouring of scholarly literature and popular press on degrowth is evidence that the idea is becoming important, or at least people are recognizing that. And another piece of evidence for that is that well-known economists and political pundits are writing little things about how they think degrowth is the worst idea in the world. So they're feeling threatened by the idea, at least, and threatened by the fact that it resonates a lot with ordinary people who are concerned about the environment, ordinary people who are concerned about inequality. Stopping pursuing growth and instead pursuing directly the goals that the society wants to pursue is an idea that's having a lot of resonance right now. So I want to clarify, degrowth isn't about like, oh, we're just going to produce less and then we'll be better off. It's that if governments and civil society work toward making us better off ecologically, better off socially, psychologically, in terms of climate change, then that might entail producing less. So we need economies that can handle shrinking. Like if you think about if everybody had their housing guaranteed and they didn't have to pay rent to a landlord, then people might just choose to work less and get by purchasing fewer things with the extra time off. Or if there was a moratorium on new fossil fuel extraction to save the stable climate, like that could constrain the total amount that the economy is able to produce. Like if you're going to reduce the material throughput of the economy, then you're probably going to see shrinkage in the sense of recession, in the sense of GDP going down, and we need to reorganize the economy to meet people's needs regardless. So if I haven't yet convinced you that degrowth is a good idea, there's these arguments about, growth doesn't deliver well-being or happiness, or it's not necessary for human health and longevity. But I want to make the case that organizing society around the pursuit of GDP growth is absurd. If you pay half a city's unemployed people to break all the windows in town in the morning, and you pay them the other half to replace them in the afternoon, then that's going to increase GDP in the short run. And if a hurricane breaks the window, same result. It stimulates the economy, because GDP counts costs and not benefits, and it fails to capture any aspects of good living that aren't bought and sold. And as you can see with this chart, compound exponential growth shoots to infinity. So growing at a constant percentage per year shoots to infinity. And global GDP, you can hardly see it now. You can hardly see it in this chart now, is 30 times bigger than it was in 1900. So the global economy produces 30 times more than it did in 1900. And if it continues growing at 3% per year, it's going to be 10 times bigger by the end of the 21st century, and somehow maybe use 10 times more materials taken from the earth, which is hard to even fathom. And to what end, if especially in wealthy countries where there's already enough to go around and it's poorly distributed, what's growth going to fix is sort of the question I want to pose. So thinking about it in terms of agriculture, what does degrowth have to do with agriculture? What I study in Vermont is non-market food, so food that's not for sale, people's hunting and fishing and foraging and charity, gardening, stuff like that. And so, is it that there might be a change in social conditions that allows for people, like the pandemic did very briefly, to focus more on things like producing their own food? Or is it that, and I like this, I guess I want to say I like this image. I know I'm running out of time, but I like this image as an image of degrowth, because it shows that degrowth isn't incompatible with something resembling modernity. It's just how could Canada get along with the size of economy that Canada had in the 1970s instead of the continuing to grow from 2020. And I show this image because it's sort of a provocation in the other direction, to say degrowth is sort of an invitation to ask ourselves, what is the good life and how do we pursue that as a culture? And it's not, and it doesn't need to be the same everywhere for everyone all the time. It's just saying, if the goal isn't to produce more and more and consume more and more, then what's a good life and how do we want to spend it? Are we reducing agricultural labor over time over the last 300 years because it's a bad thing, or is that a dignified livelihood that more people should have the chance to pursue? So just to wrap it up, I'm really excited to hear how you respond to some of these questions and what questions you might have for me. Degrowth is stopping growth and organizing to live together well without it. And what does that have to do with agriculture? So I want to leave you with. Really excited to hear.